So I'm going to throw out a few random thoughts, not completely random, obviously, but so it's going to scatter across a few observations. I'm really pleased that we are talking about coalitions and the importance of coalitions to get behind learning and a sort of the alignment across society, because we cannot leave everything just to governments which are not accountable. I'm disappointed that the bank's framing of coalitions for alignment doesn't quite link up with, I think, the GEM report focus on accountability. How do we get that coalition building which will then reinforce accountability systems? I think there's some interesting convergence that could come about from that. I think it's disappointing that neither report really captures what I think is one of the big stories of recent years, last 15 years, is the emergence of national education coalitions in about 85 countries which weren't there 15 years ago, which linked NGOs, teacher unions, parents groups and others. It's a mixed history, but there's some very, very important learning there about how to reinforce accountability and how to build coalitions for reform. I actually quite like the framing of this being, many of the challenges being a crisis of accountability. I think it's in some ways more innovative and interesting framing than a crisis of learning. One of the lovely things I think in both reports is a bit more of a focus on teachers than has been the case in recent times. A recognition that teachers, professional teachers, and the quality of teachers plays a really pivotal, important role in changing what happens in the classroom. It's amazing how often people have talked about improving learning outcomes and not talked about teachers, which is astonishing to me. I do think the bank's report focuses somewhat too much on the assessment of learning rather than the improvement of learning, and that's a really serious problem. I think we need to, there is a bit of a mystification or a belief that assessment will always lead to improvements, will always lead to reforms. There are one or two questioning comments about high stakes assessment and challenges to that in the bank's report, but I don't think it quite gets under the skin of how do you frame assessment. Formative assessment, the range of different forms of assessment that you could use. It's a bit of sort of a bit of everything rather than really getting under the skin of how to focus on using assessment to improve learning. There's a lot of very good common sense, I think, in the Global Education Monitoring Report around the sort of how do you put in place strong national education sector plans which are developed in a consultative way with clear targets, with budgets that are aligned to the delivery of those targets and with systematic monitoring. It's amazing how little common sense is often talked about in these big global reports. I think it's a shame that none of them then brings it back to looking at really practical examples of where that is happening, and for example the role of the Global Partnership for Education in putting in place mechanisms about consultation for the development of sector plans. There's a lot that can be learnt from, I think, the experiences of the Global Partnership for Education in that area. I was very disappointed by the lack of focus or sufficient focus on access and equity in the World Development Report. The decision to focus on learning outcomes and not for picking up on sufficiently on these other threads, and particularly in terms of equity, looking at gender and disability. I liked two final things I'll say. Great to see the scepticism about the private sector in both reports. It's actually quite refreshing. The World Bank report talks about the lack of evidence of learning gains from low-cost private schools once you control for socio-economic status of the students. That's actually very refreshing, and I think it's very good for the Global Education Monitoring Report to flag the problems with market-based accountability systems and the impact that that has on equity. It seems to me it's time for us to reassert the important, and perhaps be, in both reports, be more explicit and consistent in talking about the need for reforming and strengthening public systems. And I'm not very happy with the idea of unsettling public systems. I think let's talk about reforming and scaling up, because the one thing that both reports really fail to deliver on enough is discussion about the financing of education. This is the World Bank report. You'd expect from the bank some attention to financing. There's almost nothing in there, and that's very dangerous. There's a bit of a dangerous myth constructed that learning doesn't always lead to improvements. That's a sort of self-evident statement, but people have started to tend to shorten that and say more spending doesn't improve learning, when clearly more spending is needed as a necessary condition for improving learning. It's not sufficient. How you spend the money is still hugely important, but unless we get more money on the table in many cases, there's a real problem. And I was disappointed that the GEM report has been focusing on this 15% of national budgets and 4% of GDP, whereas actually the targets really are 20% of budgets and 6% of GDP. And neither report really delivers any insights into the challenges which have been put forward by the Education Commission report that talks about the massive scale-up of financing needed, and you need to get beyond the share of the budget to start talking about the domestic tax base, how you can expand financing in a sustainable and credible way. So many gaps, but some good insights at the same time. Thank you.